I will therefore start right away with a brief introduction of all three speakers. The main speaker of this panel is Paul Hanebrink, professor of history and Jewish studies at Rutgers University. He is the author of two monographs. The first one is In Defense of Christian Hungary, Religion, Nationalism, and Anti-Semitism, from 1890 to 1944. And more recently, A Spectre Hunt in Europe, The Myth of Judeo-Bolshevism, from 2018. The first responder will be Manuela Consonni. She is the Pella and Adam Starkov Chair in Holocaust Studies at the Department of Jewish History and Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University, Jerusalem. She's also current director of the Vidal Sassoon Center for Study of Antisemitism. Among her publications are the monograph Resistance or Holocaust, the Memory of the Deportation and Extermination in Italy. Okay, I'm skipping. And the forthcoming book on Primo Levi, titled Shedding Skins. Okay? Good. Thank you. And finally, Atina Grossmann, professor of history at the Cooper Union in New York. She has many publications. I will only read a few. I will only read two. Jews, Germans, and Allies, Close Encounters in Occupied Germany from 2007. And then I'll skip to the most recent one. All right. Our Courage, Unser Mut, Jews in Europe after 1945, together with Kay Bohus.
Thank you to Sky and to all of the organizers for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure to be here with everyone to learn so much in the last few days. I'm also going to begin with someone who was invoked in the last session and also earlier, the historian Tim Mason. In one of his last interventions, published shortly after his untimely death in 1990 as Whatever Happened to Fascism, the great Tim Mason reflected on a trend that he had observed among many of his colleagues at that time. He said that historians of Nazi Germany had largely abandoned the comparative study of fascism in order to focus more closely on the origins and implementation of the Holocaust. Fascism had become old hat. Mason gave many reasons for this in the essay, but among the most important was a shift in moral perspective. The Holocaust, rather than the rise or spread of fascism, now dominated, quote, moral, political, and professional concerns. Mason worried about the political implications of abandoning a broad perspective on fascism in history, but he also acknowledged the analytical reality. Nazi racism, Mason wrote, quote, has always threatened to shatter generic concepts of fascism. The racist anti-Semitism at the core of Nazi ideology seemed so uniquely obsessive and destructive as to defy comparison with the racism and anti-Semitism of other fascist movements and regimes. 35 years later, Mason's concern resonates in new ways. Today, far-right movements on both sides of the Atlantic share fears of demographic collapse and racial replacement by hordes of migrants. Some of the enemies they demonize come from their gender politics, gender ideology, the gay agenda, childless cat ladies. But others, the global mastermind George Soros, nameless cosmopolitan elites, cultural Marxists, are thinly veiled examples of anti-Semitism. At the same time, the protests of committed anti-racists have not been free of anti-Semitic language either, a point of fierce debate most recently in connections with protests against the ongoing brutality of the Israel-Hamas war. These contradictions defy easy analysis. Is anti-Semitism a subspecies of modern racism, to be understood and fought in the same way as other ethnic hatreds? Or is it a special form of conspiratorial thinking with a unique historical genealogy going all the way back to the Middle Ages? Similar questions also divide the field of Holocaust and genocide studies. Was the Shoah a civilizational break, unique in human history? Are Stalinist crimes the nearest equivalent? Or are the origins of Auschwitz to be found at Windhoek in Namibia, where colonial Germany committed genocide against the Herero and Nama peoples in the first years of the 20th century? Nazism, Tim Mason insisted 35 years ago, was, quote, a peculiar part of something larger. So was Nazi racism. But what was that something larger, and what is it to us now? These questions go to the heart of this session on anti-Semitism and racism. In this paper, I will argue that the two are perpetually entangled, but that their relationship to each other in fascist and far-right politics is unstable and always shifting. To start our discussion, I want to look closely at the entanglement of racism and anti-Semitism at three different historical moments between 1918 and 1945. In each of the scenes that I will describe, I'll consider first the operation of the two in that particular time and place, before expanding outwards to a comparative and transnational European level, with all of the caveats, of course, about wading into national historiographies with which one is more or less familiar. Moving from one scene to the next over time, we can see, I think, the consolidation of a racialized anti-Semitism that spread widely as the influence of Nazi Germany grew. This particular fusion of racism and anti-Semitism fueled the Holocaust, and its legacy continues to haunt debates about genocide today. So I'll track the evolving entanglements of anti-Semitism and racism during the fascist era, and then at the end reflect briefly on their further transformations today, 80 years after the collapse of Nazi Germany. Okay, so first scene, Budapest, a cold and raw day in mid-November 1919. A band of paramilitary groups marches into the city, led by a former admiral in the Austro-Hungarian army named Miklos Horthy. The men were counter-revolutionaries. For 3.5 months that summer, Bolsheviks had ruled Hungary, stripping the country's traditional elites of their power and terrifying the peacemakers gathered in Paris with the specter of a global revolutionary movement. When the Bolshevik regime collapsed, Horthy and his army stepped into the vacuum and began to exact revenge. They targeted leftists, labor leaders, and above all, Jews. Because some of Hungary's Bolshevik leaders had Jewish origins, the counter-revolutionaries decided that Bolshevism was a Jewish plot to overthrow the social order. They called this conspiracy Judeo-Bolshevism. In order to defeat the Judeo-Bolshevik enemy, Hungary needed, they said, a strong Christian nationalist course. In practical terms, this meant the violent suppression of the left. It also meant a wave of paramilitary violence called the White Terror. For several years, armed bands settled scores, raped and looted, extorted money from those who could not defend themselves, and attacked people suspected, often wrongly, of supporting Bolshevism. Between 1919 and 1924, 3,000 to 5,000 people were killed in these reprisals, 50,000 to 70,000 Hungarians were imprisoned on political charges, and as many as 100,000 were forced to flee the country. Many of the victims were Jewish Hungarians. Meanwhile, the churches preached Hungary's Christian resurrection in the pulpits and at public ceremonies. The fusion of anti-Semitism and anti-communism that fueled Hungary's counter-revolution was conceptually slippery. It was decisively shaped by Christian religious and cultural traditions that cast Jews as the perennial enemies of order and morality. And seen in this way, Judeo-Bolshevism was a new iteration of the age-old Jewish plot that originated with the ritual murder accusations of the Middle Ages. But Judeo-Bolshevism was also a thoroughly modern and secular ideological construction that colored many varieties of anti-communism after World War I. Some of the counter-revolutionaries who supported Admiral Horthy in 1919 called themselves race defenders, and they would later become fascists. Others remained traditional conservatives until the very end and preferred to think of Judeo-Bolshevism as a kind of spiritual or cultural threat. A survey of Hungarian right-wing thought from the period reveals that Judeo-Bolshevism could be understood variously as a sign that Christian civilization was in danger, as another facet of the ongoing Jewish grab for power, or as proof that Jews were an existential threat to the survival of Hungarians as a race. The idea of Judeo-Bolshevism elided neat boundaries between race, religion, and culture. It was ideologically powerful precisely because it could harmonize many different forms of anti-Semitism into a coherent and for the right politically inclusive theory of Jewish conspiracy. Now, of course, Hungary's counter-revolutionaries were not the only ones to identify Jews with Bolshevism. The specter of Judeo-Bolshevism, the belief that Jews caused revolution in order to benefit from it, circulated freely across Europe in the interwar years, becoming an integral part of anti-leftist and anti-communist politics in many countries and in many different milieus. In some places, it was the only overlapping element between political actors who were otherwise bitterly opposed. In Ukraine, between 1918 and 1921, Ukrainian nationalists, local warlords, Russian White Army loyalists, and armed peasant bands had little in common except the belief that Jewish communists were the enemy. As many as 180,000 Jews lost their lives in pogroms that consumed Ukraine in these years. In Germany, right-wing nationalists followed developments to the east closely. The early Nazis, in particular, took horror tales spread by émigrés in Russia of Jewish Bolshevik crimes there as proof that Jews had created Bolshevism in order to seize power in Germany. Other fascists, from Latvia to France, made the idea of Judeo-Bolshevism part of their worldview as well. But the fusion of anti-Semitism and anti-communism was not exclusive to the extreme right. Conservative Lutherans from Finland to Germany believed that Jewish Bolsheviks were a danger to moral order everywhere and expressed their fears in religious and cultural terms. So did Vatican diplomats, as Juliana Comidis has shown. A wide spectrum of anti-socialists in Catholic Austria shared the belief that Red Vienna was a stronghold of Jewish revolutionaries, and in 1930s Spain, the Catholic Church and the nationalists shared a common conviction that the civil war there was a crusade to eradicate Judeo-Masonic Bolshevism from society once and for all. The idea of Judeo-Bolshevism forged alliances across the right, and between religious actors and secular racists, it provided a familiar language of Jewish conspiracy and inversion, of a world turned upside down by Jewish power, to reframe challenges to social order from the left as dangers to national sovereignty. It identified international Jewish revolutionaries as the source of panic about migration and border security. And it authorized anti-communists to use state power against the Jewish danger. At the height of the Polish-Soviet War, the fledgling Polish state interned Jewish soldiers in camps out of fear that Jews would betray the country to the Red Army. There was also a consensus opinion in many countries after World War I, shared by medical officials, security forces, and cultural critics, that Jewish refugees should be deported before they could infect society with their revolutionary sedition. In Munich, cradle of the Nazi Party, police officials deported so-called Eastern or Galician Jews on the grounds that they were carriers of Bolshevik ideas and a harmful alien body in the German folk that does not serve the general good, but instead pursues its private racial advantage. These are the words of the police commissioner in Munich at the time. Fear of Jewish radicalism fueled similar calls for restricting Jewish immigration or expelling Jewish refugees from Romania to France to the United States and Argentina. Most ominously, fear of subversive Jewish power led to legal discrimination. Hungary led the way with the first anti-Jewish law in post-war Europe, a 1920 measure that limited the number of Jews who could enroll in university. Counter-revolutionaries justified the legislation by claiming that Jewish professionals had proven especially susceptible to anti-national radicalism. But the law's real purpose was to undo the principle of equality before the law and to stigmatize Jews as anti-national aliens. Some saw Jews as a racial danger, others saw them as a cultural threat, but all of them saw Jews as un-Hungarian. One of the law's most fervent supporters, a Catholic bishop who often described Jews as a separate race, argued that lawmakers had a duty to save the Hungarian Christian nation, not to preserve the rule of law. His tortured logic was a harbinger of what was to come. Second scene. Rome, spring of 1937. Italy was building an empire in Ethiopia, which it had conquered the year before. Popular songs cast the regime's new imperial subjects as exotic objects of desire and celebrated Italy's soldiers as gallant masters come to liberate them. But fascist officials worried about the consequences of these colonial fantasies. What if Italian soldiers had sex with Ethiopian women and fathered a generation of mixed-race children? As Italian East Africa became reality, racial experts fueled anxieties with a flood of studies about the dangers of miscegenation in the colonies. Marianne Matar-Bonucci has written about this. They warned that a new category of mixed-race children would imperil Italy's racial vitality and damage Italy's prestige as a white European power. Convinced by these arguments, Mussolini addressed the Great Council of Fascism and declared that it was necessary, quote, to confront the racial problem and to introduce it into fascist literature and doctrine. The rising racial panic soon bore fruit. In April 1937, a new law outlawed relations of a conjugal nature between Italian citizens and subjects of the empire. The fascist regime was going to police sex in order to protect the Italian race. Italy's first race law was not an anti-Jewish law. Indeed, anti-Semitism had not been central to the ideology of Italian fascism, in contrast, stark contrast, to German Nazism. That soon changed. The very next year, fascist lawmakers strengthened the anti-miscegenation law as part of a raft of new anti-Semitic laws. The new version defined Italians by race. It once again prohibited conjugal relations with imperial subjects, and it banned marriage between Italians and Jews. The revised law reflected the regime's new emphasis on promoting racial consciousness. At the center of these efforts was an illustrated magazine devoted to race thinking, La Difesa della Razza, which was widely distributed in schools, universities, libraries, and public offices throughout Italy. The magazine was a platform for racial anti-Semitism. During its brief 5-year existence, a stream of articles analyzed every conceivable anti-Jewish trope from competing theoretical perspectives, all in an effort to show the Jew as the racial antithesis of Italian Aryans. But the magazine showcased racism as a modern scientific and biological concept in other ways also. Photo montages superimposed grotesque images of white Italians on images of black Africans in order to illustrate the perils of race mixing. And Italy's race experts published articles that explained and legitimized racial hierarchies in the colonies. The editors of La Difesa della Razza telegraphed the intersection of racism and anti-Semitism by reprinting in full a manifesto formulated by Italian racial scientists in 1938 to promote biological theories of race. The so-called Manifesto of Race declared, quote, "It is time for Italians to declare themselves genuinely racist." Point 8 read, quote, "It is necessary to make a clear distinction between Mediterranean peoples of Europe, Westerners, on the one hand, and Africans and Easterners on the other." Point 9, Jews do not belong to the Italian race. Both the manifesto and the revised race-mixing law were inspired by ways of thinking about race that had roots in modern scientific and aesthetic currents originating in the 18th century, currents that George Mosse analyzed so brilliantly in his 1978 book, Toward the Final Solution, A History of European Racism, which I'm sure is over there, and if we actually do get a coffee break, you can take a look at it. By the turn of the 20th century, these ideas had begun to produce policy. On both sides of the Atlantic, experts used the findings of racial science to imagine strategies for increasing the number and quality of desirable members of society, regenerating the nation into a community of new men and women, and reducing or eliminating the undesired. Scientific racism offered new reasons to maintain the color line between whites and non-whites. It also provided an objective rationale, for treating Jews as a separate and inferior race. No state has seemed to epitomize the fusion of racism and anti-Semitism into a coherent and all-pervasive racial policy like Hitler's Germany. In 1991, historians Wolfgang Wippermann and Michael Burley published a now classic book in which they described the Nazi state as a racial state. For them, the Nuremberg laws, which forbade marriage and sex between Aryans and Jews and classified persons of mixed ancestry by their amount of Jewish blood, were one part of a battery of biopolitical measures that included marriage review boards, racial passports, sterilization of the unfit, murder of the disabled, and the internment of Roma and Sinti people. All of these were designed to build a healthy and expanding German nation destined to colonize Eastern Europe and flourish there as racial masters. By the late 1930s, think tanks had studied where Germans could settle, what lands and property they could seize, and how they should rule over the inferior or subhuman Slavs and Jews who already lived there. When the German army invaded Poland in 1939, these plans went live. Nazi occupiers began to build a new empire in the East by settling Germans in Polish homes, reducing Poles to slave labor, and isolating Jews in ghettos where they were left to starve and die. This German example exerted a powerful influence on fascist and authoritarian regimes across interwar Europe. For years, eugenicists in fascist Italy had debated ways to increase birth rates, improve the quality of the Italian population, and modernize society through different kinds of demographic policies, settlement schemes, and genetic studies. Racial anthropologists like Lidio Cipriani also warned of the threat that racially inferior Africans posed to the strength and virility of the fascist new man. These experts disagreed vehemently about how to define race. Some believed that culture played an important role in defining national races like the Italian. Others emphasized biology and heredity. For a long time, however, very few of Italy's racial experts spent a lot of time writing about Jews. That changed by the 1930s, when the Nazi example propelled an ever-present, but relatively marginal anti-Semitic milieu within Italian fascism into the spotlight. Led by Telesio Interlandi, who was the editor of La Difesa della Razza, these anti-Semites warned that the Judaization of Italy was imminent and promised that defeating this danger would regenerate the Italian people. With new support from the fascist regime, Italy's racial scientists consciously modeled their anti-Semitic laws on Germany's Nuremberg laws. Meanwhile, racist scientists and philosophers found a new platform for their debates about eugenics, heredity, and relationship between race, culture, and spirit in the pages of La Difesa della Razza. Race thinking took a similar turn in Eastern Europe, where eugenics also had a long history as a respected science with solutions for the problems of demographic decline, low life expectancy, and anxieties about indeterminate ethnic identities. Here, too, debates about the relative importance of culture, biology, and heredity to a nation's racial essence were fierce. Often, though not always, and not to the same extent in every country in the region, eugenicists linked discussions about how to solve the local Jewish question to their plans for national regeneration. As Nazi influence, and with it the prestige of Nazi racial science, spread across Eastern Europe, race-based analyses of Jews and the Judaization of national society won ever more adherents. In time, authoritarian regimes in the region wrote their own versions of the Nuremberg laws. In 1940, Romania introduced racial laws that categorized Jews as a race, forbade marriage between Jews and Romanians, and defined Romanian national identity by blood. Hungary passed a similar law in 1941. At the same time, Hungarian racial experts also discussed plans to protect pure-born Hungarians by physically separating them from the Roma, on the grounds that Romani people were biologically inferior, work-shy, and prone to disease. But Italy's anti-miscegenation law had another genealogy that extended ideologically and geographically far beyond Nazi Germany. The men who ruled Europe's liberal empires also worried that sexual relations between races would erode the racial hierarchy essential to colonial rule. To allay their fears, administrators from Indonesia to India to French West Africa devised a wide variety of rules, practices, and classification schemes to govern sexual arrangements and emotional attachments between Europeans and their colonial subjects. Italian anxieties about race mixing and their ambition to police intimacy in Italian East Africa had parallels in European colonies around the world. Nor were the Nuremberg laws, on which fascist Italy based its anti-Semitic race laws, entirely original either. German legal scholars studied race codes in the U.S. South before they wrote their own laws to regulate race in Nazi society. They found the Jim Crow laws instructive, refining their own ideas about how to measure Jewish blood by intensely debating and ultimately rejecting the American one-drop rule. American racism was influential in other ways also. The eugenics movement in the United States enjoyed tremendous prestige in Nazi Germany and many other countries. According to historian Francesco Casata, German and American eugenics, I quote, furnished the most solid scientific support for the biological racism of la difesa della razza. And Adolf Hitler famously admired the work of American white supremacist Madison Grant, whose book, The Passing of the Great Race, described the threats to America's white Nordic stock from immigrants, African Americans, and Jews. Hitler called the book his Bible and wrote a personal letter to Grant thanking him for it. In sum, fears of miscegenation and degeneration circulated between every kind of state and regime, and a wide variety of actors found the conclusions of racial and eugenics experts to be a fruitful way of understanding the Jewish question as well. Third scene, February 1943. The Palace of Sport in Berlin. The Nazi war against the Jews had already claimed most of its victims. Many horrors were still to come, of course: the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto, the lightning-fast mass deportations of Hungarian Jews, the death marches, but 75 to 80% of all victims of the final solution were dead by mid-February 1943. By contrast, the war in the East had taken a very different turn. The German army had just suffered a massive defeat at Stalingrad. The Sixth Army had surrendered. Nearly 100,000 German soldiers were now prisoners of war in the Soviet Union. At this crucial moment, Joseph Goebbels, Nazi Minister of Propaganda, gave a speech in Berlin's Sportpalast that was broadcast across the entire Reich. He explained the gravity of the crisis, and he described what a Soviet victory would mean. He said, quote, "A Bolshevization of the Reich would mean the liquidation of our entire intelligentsia and leadership and the descent of our workers into Bolshevist Jewish slavery." He went on to describe the Soviet Union as a composite of multiple racial threats. Subhuman Slavs and their Jewish masters, acting in concert, were coming to destroy Germany, erase its culture, and enslave its people. Behind the oncoming Soviet divisions, he said, we see the Jewish liquidation commandos, and behind them terror, the specter of mass starvation, and complete anarchy. Germans, he proclaimed, must prepare themselves to fight a total war for survival against the approaching racial deluge. He ended his speech with the allusion to the vision of all-out insurrectionary warfare born in the Napoleonic Wars of the previous century. Now people rise up and let the storm break loose. Racism and anti-Semitism were tightly linked in Hitler's war against the Soviet Union. From the onset of Operation Barbarossa in summer 1941, Nazi propaganda defined the Soviet enemy as a racial ideological threat in two distinct but intersecting ways. The Soviet Union was an empire run by Jews who had built a Jewish Bolshevik system they wanted to impose on the rest of the world. It was also home to tens of millions of racially inferior Slavs and Asiatic peoples ready to spill into Europe and pollute it. The myth of Judeo-Bolshevism tied these two enemy images together. Unrestrained and escalating violence fused them ever more tightly. When the German army crossed the Soviet border, killing squads began a ruthless campaign against imaginary Jewish Bolshevik partisans. The slaughter quickly escalated into mass shootings of entire Jewish communities. Soon, Nazi leaders concluded that the final solution of the Jewish question in Europe could not wait until after the war. Parallel to this, the German army brutally mistreated Soviet POWs, whom they considered racially inferior and outside the protection of the normal laws of war. Starving, exposed to disease, and often summarily shot, over 3 million Soviet soldiers died in German captivity. Nazi ambitions went further. Occupation officials drafted a so-called hunger plan that characterized millions of Soviet citizens as useless eaters, slated for natural death by famine, while Nazi forces shipped tons of food back to Germany. Never fully implemented, the plan nonetheless was the basis for the deliberate starvation and depopulation of Kyiv and Kharkiv in Ukraine. The sheer scale and scope of Nazi crimes against humanity, Nazi war crimes, is staggering. But not all enemies occupied the same place in the Nazi imagination. The racist conviction that Slavs were subhuman and their lives were worthless was the product of imperialist ambition and colonial brutality. As Nazi planners imagined a vast future empire stretching from Poland to the rich black earth of Ukraine, they dehumanized whole populations into abstractions that could be relocated, depopulated, starved, and enslaved at will. These policies recalled the violence that the German army unleashed in their genocidal war against the Herero in southwest Africa decades earlier at the turn of the 20th century. But the Jewish enemy was different. From the very first, Nazi party leaders had argued that a powerful internal foe was to blame for Germany's defeat in World War I. Jews were the hostile force standing behind the November criminals who had signed the armistice in 1918. The Weimar Republic that followed had been nothing but a Jewish republic. To preserve their future as a people, Germans would need to eliminate the real army within, even as they armed themselves to fight against enemies without. This struggle was existential. As he said in the Landsberg prison in 1923, writing Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler imagined a world the day after Jews won final victory as, quote, a planet moving through the ether devoid of men. 19 years later, Hermann Göring declared that the invasion of the Soviet Union was about, quote, whether the German and Aryan prevails here or whether the Jew rules. By this twisted racial logic, mass shootings of Jews in Ukraine and mass gassings in death camps could all be justified in the same way that Hitler had justified the invasion of the Soviet Union, as preventive self-defense. Germany's race war in the East was so murderous because the Nazi struggle against the Soviet Judeo-Bolshevik system combined two violent ideological strands. It was, one, a vicious imperialist war to destroy the Soviet state and subject Slavs and other Soviet peoples to colonial rule, and two, it was an obsessive and endless civil war to defend German life everywhere, directed first and foremost against Jews. This conflation of racism and anti-Semitism had broad appeal. From the start of Operation Barbarossa, Nazi propagandists had marketed the invasion of the Soviet Union as a crusade to defend Europe from Jewish Bolshevism. And in his 1943 Sportpalast speech, Goebbels warned that the looming racial apocalypse threatened all Europe and not just Germany. His words, and the vision of united and racially ordered Europe that underpinned them, resonated across the continent. From Lithuania to France, local fascists shared a common Judeo-Bolshevik enemy with their German occupiers and were willing to help them deport and murder Jews because of it. Germany's war of racial self-defense, so-called, also inspired fascist intellectuals in many countries to theorize Europeanness as a racial identity. In France, pro-Nazi intellectuals like Lucien Rebatté and other writers grouped around the newspaper Je suis partout picked up on Goebbels' language of crusade. They embraced the Nazi New Order to imagine the rebirth of France that had been weakened and corrupted by Jews. The essence of Frenchness, they claimed, had begun to dissolve, and they devoted article after article to a nostalgic yearning for what they imagined to be France's lost boundaries, a France that enjoyed mastery over its colonial subjects abroad and was secure in its own identity at home. Nazi victory would restore racial order and allow for a kind of reset across the continent. National Socialist Germany, Rebaté declared, had done the Christian Occident a great service. Every European nation would have a chance in a fascist Europe to restore and strengthen its national culture. The Hungarian fascist writer István Milotai made the same argument. He warned that Europe would be, quote, thrown to mass death, mass extermination, massacre, and the depth of mass graves if the Jewish kosher butchers won. Human civilization, he said, and the freedom of Christian nations depended on Jewish victory, on German victory, German victory. And in Italy, Julius Evola drew closer to Nazi Germany as he expounded on the spiritual racial hierarchies that defined Aryan European civilization. Though Evola's ideas were too murky to appeal to Goebbels, they were celebrated after the collapse of the Third Reich by a new generation of extreme rightists trying to reimagine fascism as a pan-European movement. So to bring it back to the present, the nightmare of racial extinction that Goebbels described in his 1943 Sportpalast speech has had a long afterlife. In his address, he warned of Jewish liquidation commandos at the head of the Red Army, projecting onto the Soviets the moral responsibility for the crime of genocide that the Germans had already committed. Goebbels' propaganda machinery reinforced this counter-memory of German victimization. Until the very last days of the war, his ministry churned out newsreels of atrocities committed by Soviet soldiers against German civilians in East Prussia or at the outskirts of Berlin that invariably described the perpetrators as Mongol or Asiatic barbarians. In our own time, a variety of far-right subcultures have revived and refashioned this counter-memory of racial victimization to fit a post-colonial world. Nazi fears of the extinction of racially superior Germans at the hands of Jewish Bolsheviks and subhuman Slavs have become a nihilistic vision of white genocide at the hands of surging Africans, Asians, and their Jewish helpers. Far-right activists infuse this toxic stew of racism and explicit or implicit anti-Semitism into the stories they tell about other race wars in Rhodesia and other unredeemed defeats like Vietnam or Algeria. They circulate texts like the Turner Diaries or Jean Raspail's The Camp of Saints that reproduce this language. And they commit acts of terrorism from Charleston, South Carolina to Christchurch, New Zealand in its name. But, and this is my last point, the entangled and unstable configuration of racism and anti-Semitism remains in constant motion. And I think there's no better example of this today than the case of Hungary. The current Hungarian government champions a return to Christian nationalism just like the counter-revolutionary regime of the interwar years. It wants to end migration in order to preserve the racial homogeneity of European nations. And it demonizes globalist NGOs, anti-national cosmopolitans, and cultural Marxists, blaming them for declining birth rates and a fraying sense of identity, leading inexorably to national death. And these screeds rework familiar anti-Semitic tropes into new contexts. But at the same time, Hungary today cultivates excellent relations with the Israeli right. It presents itself as an ally in the global fight against anti-Semitism, and it calls out attacks on Jews in the United States and Western Europe as proof of the left's hypocrisy. They are not alone in this. There is now a lively intellectual exchange between Hungary and the American right. These are novel positions with no roots in the ideological battles of the interwar decades. To understand these developments, we need to consider the generative power that the legacy and memory of fascism continue to have, but we must also be alert to the ways that the right has transformed itself in response to a new ideological moment. Thank you.